What happens when a woman who spent 10 years believing her husband was rotting in prison suddenly finds him living free, clean-shaven, with a new wife, 2 kids, and no trace of shame? For Margaret Ellis, that discovery didn't just reopen old wounds, it set fire to a rage so dark that it ended in blood. Betrayal cuts deeper than any blade. But betrayal mixed with deception, abandonment, and 10 years of silence. That's a wound that never heals. Margaret's life was destroyed once when her husband Daniel was convicted of drug abuse. She rebuilt from the ashes, raising her daughter alone, living with the stigma of being the wife of an addict. But 10 years later, fate brought her face to face with a truth she never imagined: Daniel was not where she thought he was. He wasn't in prison. He was free, happy, living another life, while she struggled to survive the shame he left behind. And when Margaret's world collided with Daniel's new reality, everything snapped. Before we unravel this shocking tale of deception, betrayal, and revenge, make sure to subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and stay tuned for more true crime stories where we explore the darkest corners of the human heart. The story of Margaret Ellis didn't begin with blood, betrayal, or rage. No, those things came later. Her story began, like so many tragic ones, in the small comforts of an ordinary family that was never as perfect as it appeared. Margaret was 32 years old the first time she realized her husband, Daniel, was slipping away from her. Back then, she thought marriage was about weathering storms together, about being the kind of couple that pushed through rough times, even when those rough times began to chip away at trust. Daniel Ellis was the man everyone in their neighborhood admired. At 6 feet tall, with sandy brown hair always combed neatly to the side, and blue eyes that seemed to smile even before his mouth did, he carried an air of confidence. He had a steady job as a mid-level manager at a logistics firm, drove a reliable car, and always made sure his family had what they needed. On Sundays, he would barbecue in the backyard while the neighbors peeked over their fences, commenting on how lucky Margaret was. That Daniel, they'd say, he's a good one. Margaret believed it, too, at least at first. She loved him with a sincerity that made her overlook little things. The late nights. The sudden mood swings. The unexplained expenses. But cracks were forming in their life long before she saw them. It started small. A bottle of pills in the bathroom cabinet, just for stress, Daniel had said, brushing off her questions. A smell on his clothes she couldn't quite place, sharp, chemical, and sour. She dismissed it because love makes you dismiss what you should question. And then there were the lies. Late meeting at work. Traffic was crazy tonight. I was with the guys, didn't want to bother you. Each excuse stacked on top of the last like fragile cards, waiting for the day they would collapse. Margaret wasn't a fool, though. Somewhere deep inside, she knew. She felt it when he wouldn't meet her eyes. She felt it when his touch grew colder, when his laughter became forced. And worst of all, she saw it when their daughter, Hannah, asked, "Why is Daddy always so tired?" Hannah was only 9 then, bright-eyed, with curly brown hair that always fell into her face. She adored her father. She would sit on his lap and tug his shirt, asking him to play. But more and more, Daniel would push her away, muttering that he needed rest. The heartbreak was quiet, subtle at first. And then it wasn't. One night, Margaret woke to find Daniel gone. His side of the bed was empty, sheets cold. She checked the living room, the kitchen, the driveway. His car was gone. Panic clawed at her throat. He stumbled in just before sunrise, disheveled, his eyes glassy, his shirt stained with something she didn't recognize. "Where were you?" she demanded. "Out," he snapped. "What's with the interrogation?" It was the first time his words cut her. Sharp. Defensive. Not the man she married. Days turned into weeks, and soon, Margaret noticed the money slipping away. Savings dwindled. Bills piled. Jewelry disappeared from her drawers. Daniel's paychecks never seemed to stretch as far as they should have. She begged him to talk. To tell her what was happening. But Daniel shut her out. And then came the arrest. It was a Tuesday night in late autumn. Margaret was cooking dinner, roast chicken, Hannah's favorite, when the pounding on the front door rattled the walls. She opened it to flashing lights, stern voices, and the cold glint of handcuffs. Daniel stood there, head bowed, flanked by 2 officers. "Ma'am, your husband is under arrest for possession of narcotics," one officer said. The world tilted. Her ears rang. Hannah clutched her leg, asking what was happening, while Margaret stood frozen, watching the man she once adored being shoved into the back of a squad car. The trial was swift. Evidence piled high, bags of cocaine, syringes, cash hidden in their garage. Margaret sat in the courtroom with Hannah beside her, the whispers of strangers filling the air. "Did you hear? He was using for years." She had no idea. Impossible. Poor woman. Poor child. The gavel slammed down with finality, 10 years. Margaret didn't cry. She couldn't. Her tears had dried up weeks before. She sat still, her hands clutching Hannah's, her mind numb. As Daniel was led away in shackles, he turned once to look at her. For a fleeting second, she thought she saw shame in his eyes. Or maybe it was just fear. That was the night Margaret's marriage ended. Not with a divorce. Not with a goodbye. But with the sound of a prison door slamming shut on the man who once promised her forever. From that moment, Margaret was no longer a wife. She was the widow of a man who wasn't dead. The stigma clung to her like a curse, neighbors whispering, friends avoiding, family judging. She carried it quietly, raising Hannah on her own, carrying the weight of Daniel's disgrace. And though 10 years would pass before she saw him again, that night, the night of his conviction, was the first cut. The broken beginning of everything that would follow. When the judge sentenced Daniel Ellis to 10 years in prison, Margaret thought her life had ended. But life didn't end, it just changed. It reshaped itself into something heavier, lonelier, and far more punishing than she had ever imagined. The morning after the trial, Margaret woke in a house that felt foreign. Daniel's coffee mug still sat on the counter, stained with the dregs from the last cup he had made. His jacket hung on the chair by the door, his shoes tucked neatly in the corner as if waiting for him to step into them. But he wasn't coming back. Not for 10 long years. Hannah, only 9, asked questions Margaret couldn't answer. Where's Daddy? When will he be home? Why are people saying bad things about him? Margaret tried to shield her, to soften the truth, but children have a way of knowing when something is broken beyond repair. Hannah's bright eyes dimmed. Her laughter quieted. She began to cling to Margaret in ways she never had before, as though she sensed that her mother was now the only steady thing she had left. It wasn't just grief Margaret carried, it was shame. Neighbors avoided her. Some out of pity, others out of judgment. At the grocery store, whispers trailed her down the aisles. Women clutched their purses tighter. Men looked at her as if she were tainted by her husband's sins. At PTA meetings, she felt the stares. No one said it aloud, but their eyes screamed, "That's the woman whose husband was arrested for drugs." Even family was no refuge. Her sister, Elaine, a woman with a perfect suburban life and a picture-perfect marriage, didn't hesitate to remind Margaret of her mistakes. "You should have seen this coming," Elaine hissed one evening. "Men don't just fall into drugs overnight. You were blind." Those words stung. But what stung more was the unspoken accusation, "You failed as a wife." Margaret carried it all, like an invisible prison sentence of her own. Money, once stable, became a constant battle. Daniel's income was gone. The bills didn't care that her husband was in prison. The mortgage, the utilities, the endless needs of a growing child, they piled up like bricks on her back. Margaret took a job as a secretary at a small law office. It wasn't glamorous, and the pay was meager, but it kept the lights on. Nights were spent hunched over the kitchen table, sorting bills, making painful choices about which ones could wait. She learned to stretch meals, to mend clothes instead of buying new, to swallow her pride when Hannah asked for things she couldn't provide. Birthdays became modest affairs. Homemade cakes instead of store-bought, second-hand dresses instead of new ones. And yet, through it all, Margaret tried to hold her head high. Hannah became Margaret's anchor. Her laughter, when it returned in small bursts, was the sound that kept Margaret from crumbling entirely. But raising Hannah alone came with its own heartbreak. At school, when other children's fathers showed up for soccer games or recitals, Hannah's seat remained empty. She would glance at the crowd, searching for a face that wasn't there. Margaret saw it, the flicker of disappointment, the quiet acceptance. One night, Hannah asked, "Mom, is Daddy ever coming back?" Margaret froze. She wanted to lie, to say yes, to give her daughter the comfort she craved. But lies had destroyed their family once already. "Not for a long time," she whispered. "And maybe, not the way we remember him." Hannah nodded silently, curling into her mother's arms. Though Daniel was locked away, his presence lingered like a ghost. Every corner of the house held his memory, the dent in the couch where he used to sit, the half-empty bottle of cologne on the dresser, the tools in the garage that grew rusty from neglect. Sometimes, late at night, Margaret would find herself staring at his photograph. She would trace the edges of his smile with her finger, wondering how she could have missed the darkness brewing inside him. There were nights she hated him. Nights she wished he had never walked into her life. But there were also nights she missed him desperately, the man he once was, before the drugs, before the lies, before everything fell apart. That war inside her, between love and hate, was a prison all its own. Life settled into a rhythm, not out of peace, but out of necessity. Margaret became strong because she had no choice. She worked. She mothered. She endured. The years ticked by slowly. Hannah grew from a little girl into a young woman, carrying both resilience and scars from her father's absence. But through it all, Margaret held on to one truth: Daniel was gone. Behind bars. Out of her life. She told herself that chapter was closed. That the pain was in the past. She had no way of knowing that 10 years later, the ghost of Daniel Ellis would walk back into her world, not as a memory, not as a prisoner, but as a living man with a new life. And when that day came, it would tear apart everything she thought she had survived. Life, by then, had settled into something Margaret Ellis could almost call manageable. The routines of survival dulled her pain. She worked at the law office during the week, cooked modest dinners at night, and spent her weekends trying to keep Hannah's world as normal as possible. It wasn't happiness. Not even close. But it was stability. Until the day that stability shattered in the most unexpected, gut-wrenching way. It was a warm Saturday afternoon in early spring. The kind of day where the world felt alive again. Where flowers bloomed along sidewalks and laughter filled the air at the community fair in their town. Margaret had reluctantly agreed to take Hannah, now 19, to the fairgrounds. Hannah insisted it would be fun, a rare chance for them to just relax. Margaret, exhausted from another long week of work, agreed. She told herself this was what life was supposed to be about now. Simple joys. Ferris wheels. The smell of popcorn and cotton candy. Music playing from the stage where a local band performed. For the first time in months, Margaret allowed herself to smile. She held a paper plate of funnel cake in her hands while Hannah chattered beside her, her curls bouncing in the sunlight. And then, she saw him. It was a moment so surreal, so impossible, that Margaret thought she was hallucinating. Across the fairground, weaving between the booths, was a man she knew better than anyone. His walk, his posture, the set of his shoulders, it was him. Daniel. Her breath hitched. The plate of funnel cake nearly slipped from her trembling hands. Daniel Ellis. The man she thought was locked away behind bars. The man who had destroyed her life 10 years ago. He was there. In the open. Free. But it wasn't just that he was free. He was smiling. Laughing. His arm wrapped tightly around a woman. A woman younger than Margaret, with long dark hair and an easy confidence. And beside them, 2 children. A boy, perhaps 7, chasing after his father's hand, and a little girl of 5, clutching a balloon as she giggled. Margaret's world stopped. She couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. The noise of the fair faded into a dull roar in her ears. Her first thought was denial. It can't be him. Her second thought was confusion. How is he here? How is he free? And her third thought, the one that burned hottest, was rage. He wasn't in prison. He wasn't rotting away as she had believed. He wasn't paying for his crimes. No. Daniel was living another life. A better life. While she struggled to feed Hannah, while she carried the weight of his shame, while she endured every whisper and every judgment, Daniel had rebuilt himself. He had traded her in for someone younger, fresher. He had made new children, as if Hannah never existed. He hadn't just abandoned her. He had erased her. Mom. What's wrong? Hannah's voice pierced through the fog. Margaret realized she had stopped walking, her face pale, her eyes wide and locked on Daniel. Hannah followed her gaze. Her daughter froze. The plate she was holding slipped from her fingers, crashing to the ground. "That's," she stammered. Her voice cracked. "That's Dad." The name tore through Margaret like a knife. Daniel turned briefly, laughing at something his young daughter said. His face was clearer now. There was no mistake. It was him. The same blue eyes, the same sharp jawline, though he looked healthier now, almost thriving. Margaret's stomach twisted. Hannah's hands shook at her sides. "Mom," Hannah whispered, her voice trembling, "you told me he was in prison." Margaret couldn't answer. Her throat was dry, her chest constricted. All she could do was stare at the man who had once been her husband, now living a life as though she and Hannah had never existed. That night, Margaret didn't sleep. She sat at the kitchen table long after Hannah had gone to bed, her hands clenched around a cup of cold tea. Her mind replayed the scene over and over. Daniel's smile. His new family. The way he looked at that woman with affection, with tenderness, an affection Margaret hadn't seen in years. She thought of Hannah, her face crumbling when she realized her father had replaced her. The betrayal in her daughter's eyes cut Margaret deeper than any blade. How? How had Daniel been free all this time? How had he escaped the sentence? How had he managed to vanish, only to reappear like this? Margaret's confusion curdled into obsession. She couldn't let it go. She wouldn't. Days later, unable to bear the questions clawing at her, Margaret did something she had never done before, she hired a private investigator. The man, older and weary-looking, sifted through court documents, prison records, and rehab logs. What he uncovered broke Margaret even further. Daniel had never served 10 years in prison. Through a plea deal, he had been sentenced to 2 years in a rehabilitation program. 2 years, not 10. After completing it, he had quietly disappeared, leaving no trace for Margaret or Hannah. And where had he gone? Just 2 towns over. Close enough to be comfortable, far enough to hide. There, he met a woman named Olivia, fell in love, married, and started a family. While Margaret carried the shame, Daniel carried nothing. He had simply stepped into a new skin, leaving his past behind. The betrayal was absolute. Margaret slammed the investigator's file shut, her hands trembling with fury. Daniel hadn't just abandoned her. He hadn't just abandoned Hannah. He had lied, vanished, and built a new life without a second thought. Every sleepless night she spent worrying. Every tear Hannah cried. Every humiliation she endured. Daniel had taken those years from them and replaced them with nothing. And now he had everything. The thought gnawed at her, burned inside her, and twisted her soul. Margaret didn't just want answers anymore. She wanted justice. Her justice. The file from the investigator sat heavy on Margaret's kitchen table, its pages spread open like wounds that refused to close. 2 years. That's all he served. 2 years in a rehab program, then freedom. Margaret stared at the photos the investigator had captured, grainy shots of Daniel outside his neat suburban home, holding hands with Olivia, the woman who had replaced her. There was Daniel at the park, tossing a ball to his son. Daniel at a school play, clapping proudly as his daughter bowed on stage. Daniel laughing, smiling, living. It was unbearable. For 10 years, Margaret carried his shame like a scar branded into her skin. For 10 years, she struggled, raised their daughter alone, worked herself to exhaustion. For 10 years, she believed he was rotting away behind cold iron bars. And all along, he was free. Free to start over. Free to build again. Free to love again. Margaret's body shook with a rage she could not contain. It wasn't the kind of anger that flared hot and burned out. No, this was a storm. A relentless, churning hurricane inside her chest, growing stronger with every breath. Hannah felt it too. When Margaret told her the truth, that Daniel had struck a deal, that he had walked free years ago, that he had abandoned them for another family, Hannah's face twisted with grief so sharp it left Margaret breathless. "He knew where we were," Hannah whispered, tears streaking her cheeks. "He knew, Mom. And he didn't even try." Margaret reached for her daughter, but Hannah pulled away. The betrayal was too much, too fresh. And that hurt Margaret more than anything. She could endure her own pain, but not Hannah's. Seeing her daughter broken by Daniel's choices was the final fracture in Margaret's already splintering heart. It was in that moment she swore to herself, Daniel would pay. Margaret began to follow him. At first, it was curiosity. She parked near his house, watching from her car as Daniel carried groceries inside. She memorized Olivia's routines, the way she left for work at 9, returned around 5, sometimes stopping at a cafe on the way home. She noted the children's schedules. The boy had soccer practice on Wednesdays, the little girl had ballet on Saturdays. Then curiosity shifted to obsession. Margaret drove past his office building, her eyes fixed on him as he exited in his pressed shirts and polished shoes. She trailed him through stores, her pulse racing, careful never to be seen. Every time she saw him smile, every time she heard his laugh carry across a parking lot, it was like acid poured into her veins. How dare he? How dare he walk through the world so freely, as though the past never happened? As though she and Hannah never existed. At night, Margaret lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind trapped in comparisons that shredded her spirit. Olivia, young and graceful, with none of the lines of hardship that marked Margaret's face. Olivia, who got the Daniel Margaret once knew, the charming, affectionate man before the drugs and the lies. And those children. Those perfect, smiling children. Margaret thought of Hannah, who had grown up fatherless, scarred by whispers, robbed of a parent. She thought of the birthdays missed, the school recitals with empty seats, the tears Hannah cried quietly in her room. Daniel had denied his daughter the love she deserved, only to give it freely to children who weren't hers. The unfairness of it clawed at Margaret until her chest felt hollow. The more she watched, the darker her thoughts became. At first, she dreamed of confronting him. Standing at his front door, making him see what he had done. Screaming the truth into his face until Olivia and the children saw the fraud he truly was. But in those fantasies, Daniel always brushed her off. He always smirked, dismissing her pain, walking back into his house as though she were nothing. That dismissal replayed so vividly in her mind that it birthed something else inside her. Something darker. Confrontation wasn't enough. He had stolen 10 years of her life. 10 years of her daughter's childhood. He had abandoned them, erased them, replaced them. Margaret began to believe that the only way to reclaim what was taken was to make sure Daniel never lived another day free. One evening, Hannah walked into the kitchen to find her mother staring blankly at the investigator's file again. "Mom," Hannah said softly, "we should just let him go. He's not worth it. We don't need him anymore." Margaret looked up at her daughter, her eyes hollow. "He stole from us," she whispered. "He stole everything. Don't you see, Hannah? We can't just let him live like this. He doesn't get to win." Hannah flinched at the coldness in her mother's tone. For the first time, she was afraid. "Mom, promise me you won't do anything stupid." Margaret forced a smile, reaching to pat Hannah's hand. "Of course, sweetheart." But it was a lie. Because in her heart, Margaret had already crossed the line. The storm inside Margaret Ellis had no calm. It churned louder each day she watched Daniel live freely, each day she saw his new family thriving while hers suffered. The storm whispered to her when she woke. It haunted her when she slept. It followed her everywhere, until it was no longer just a whisper, it was a command. And Margaret was ready to obey. The rage had transformed. It was no longer a feeling. It was a plan. On a rainy Friday night, Margaret put her plan into action. Daniel's wife had gone on a weekend trip with friends, leaving Daniel home with the kids. By midnight, the children were asleep. Margaret broke into the house, knife in hand. Daniel woke to the sound of footsteps. Confusion clouded his face when he saw her. "Margaret," he whispered, shock in his voice. "You left me. You left us," she screamed. The argument was brief, heated, filled with rage. And then Margaret snapped. She lunged. The knife plunged into Daniel's chest. Again. And again. And again. His cries faded into silence. His body crumpled on the floor. Margaret stood over him, shaking, her hands drenched in blood. The children's screams filled the house. Hannah, waiting outside in the car, heard everything. When Margaret stumbled out, covered in blood, Hannah was horrified. "What did you do, Mom?" she cried. Margaret's eyes were wild, distant. "I ended it. He can't hurt us anymore." But the damage was irreversible. The police arrived minutes later. Neighbors had called after hearing the screams. Margaret was arrested on the spot. Hannah, trembling, watched as her mother was dragged away in handcuffs. At the police station, Margaret showed no remorse. She confessed, her words laced with bitterness. "He deserved it," she said coldly. "He abandoned us. He betrayed us. He thought he could just erase us." The trial was swift. The courtroom was filled with Daniel's new wife, his children, and shocked acquaintances. Hannah testified, torn between loyalty to her mother and horror at her crime. The defense tried to argue diminished responsibility, painting Margaret as a woman broken by years of betrayal. But the prosecution was ruthless. Margaret had planned the murder, stalked Daniel, and carried it out in cold blood. The jury found her guilty of first-degree murder. Margaret Ellis lost everything. Her husband, her freedom, her daughter's trust. In her quest for revenge, she became the very thing she despised, destroyer of family, bringer of shame. Daniel's betrayal had broken her once. But it was her own choices that destroyed her completely. What do you think, viewers? Was Margaret's rage justified after 10 years of betrayal and abandonment? Or should she have walked away instead of taking a life? Thank you for staying with us through this tragic and chilling story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into the darkest crimes and the broken hearts behind them. Share your thoughts in the comments, we'd love to hear what you think.